I live in Chicago, but a few years ago I spent several months in Charleston, South Carolina. When my visit ended, I decided to return home by ship. In those days, sailing ships were the common way to travel between coastal cities. The journey from Charleston to Chicago usually took about a week, though it could be as short as 5 days with favorable winds or as long as 9 days if we had to wait for the right tide. There was no fixed schedule for departures. Passengers had to visit the shipping office, where a clerk would tell them which ships were sailing and where they were headed. After choosing a ship, passengers would have their names written on a list, and the captain would send word when it was time to board. In mid-March, I booked a cabin on a ship bound for Chicago. While waiting at my hotel, I became curious about who else would be traveling with me. I went to the shipping office and checked the passenger list. One name immediately caught my attention: Howard Brown. Howard and I had studied together at university, and we had been good friends. A few months earlier, I had received a letter from a mutual friend in New York with surprising news. Howard had married a beautiful and charming young woman. I was eager to meet Mrs. Brown and curious about what had brought the couple to Charleston. Howard was an artist who painted and also bought and sold valuable vintage paintings. Perhaps he had discovered something precious in Charleston, where old Southern families often possessed European artwork worth a fortune in Chicago. The next day, I boarded the ship and discovered that Howard had booked 3 cabins, 2 across from mine for himself, his wife and his 2 sisters, and a 3rd cabin right next to mine. I wondered who would occupy that 3rd cabin. When I finally met Howard and his wife, I was taken aback. Howard looked unwell, and he didn't seem at all pleased to see me. His wife wore a veil that covered her face, making it difficult to see her features clearly. She greeted me politely in a slow, deliberate manner with a distinct South Carolina accent. Not the Chicago accent I had expected. Howard barely acknowledged me before quickly leading his wife into their cabin and shutting the door. His rudeness surprised me, but I told myself that artists could sometimes be temperamental. My confusion deepened when 4 men carried a long wooden box onto the ship, about 6 feet in length. They brought it to the 3rd cabin beside mine, the one I thought might be for a servant. The words Brown and Chicago were painted on top of the box. As the men set it down to open the cabin door, I overheard them talking through the thin walls. "It smells bad, doesn't it?" One said. "Yes. What do you think is in it?" replied another. After they left, I grew even more curious. I convinced myself the box contained valuable paintings Howard had acquired, and I wanted to see them. That evening at dinner, I tried to speak with Howard again, but he remained distant and ate nothing. Frustrated by his cold behavior, I made a terrible mistake. I said, "Are you worried about the things in your box? I've guessed what's inside it, but I won't tell anyone." The moment those words left my mouth, Howard's face turned deathly pale. His eyes grew wide and bright with something that looked like fear or madness. Then, suddenly, he collapsed. The captain and 2 sailors carried him to his cabin while I returned to mine. unable to sleep. Through the thin walls, I heard someone enter the cabin next door. I heard the sound of metal scraping against wood, as if someone was opening the box. The next day, Howard never left that cabin. Food was brought to him, but he refused to eat. Meanwhile, the woman I had met as Mrs. Brown walked freely around the ship, chatting with other passengers. I was bewildered. I had been told Howard's wife was young, beautiful, and from Chicago. But this woman was neither young nor beautiful, and she spoke with a southern accent. Had Howard made a dreadful mistake and married the wrong woman? Was that the reason for his strange behavior? Several days after we left Charleston, a violent storm struck. The wind howled and the waves grew monstrous, tossing our ship like a toy. All night the storm raged, pushing us toward the rocky coastline. At dawn, the ship struck the rocks and began to sink rapidly. The captain shouted for everyone to abandon ship immediately and get into the small rowboats without stopping for belongings. 17 of us managed to crowd into one rowboat, including the captain and the woman I knew as Mrs. Brown. As we pulled away from the sinking ship, we suddenly saw Howard. He was dragging the long box toward the edge of the deck, his face twisted with desperate determination. "Mr. Brown, get into this boat now. The ship is sinking." The captain shouted, "I cannot leave my box. I must bring it with me." Howard cried back, his voice breaking with panic. "No, we can only take you. Leave the box. Get in now," the captain commanded. "I cannot leave my box." Howard screamed again. Unable to contain myself, I shouted, "Is your box more important than your life?" Howard turned and looked directly at me. What I saw in his eyes chilled me to my bones. There was madness there, and hatred, and something else I couldn't name. "Yes, it is," he screamed. With a final, desperate effort, he lifted the box onto the ship's railing. As he pushed it over the side, both Howard and the box plunged into the dark, churning sea. Neither surfaced again. The captain ordered us to row away immediately, and within minutes, the ship vanished beneath the waves. A week later, I met the captain again on shore. We spoke about our survival and about Howard. "It was a mistake to allow that box on my ship," the captain said quietly. "But Mr. Brown begged me so desperately that I finally agreed." "What was in the box?" I asked, though part of me already feared the answer. The captain looked at me with sad, tired eyes. "The body of Mr. Brown's wife. She died suddenly in Charleston the day before we sailed. He had to return to Chicago and couldn't bear to leave her behind. Other captains refused to carry a corpse, believing it brought bad luck. So Mr. Brown told everyone the box contained valuable paintings. That the woman you met was his servant, pretending to be his wife. Only I knew the truth. I stood there in silence, thinking of my old friend and the woman he loved so much that he chose to die with her rather than live without her.